Chapter 3 Loading Screen. Nanami's pupil was small, contracted so as not to be blinded by the light shining into it. But when Izuru waved his hand in front of her eye, it did not track the motion. He gently released her eyelid, turning off the pointer light and setting it aside. His daily examination was finished. He hadn't left the gamer's side again since his encounter with the amnesiac Enoshima 2 weeks ago. Physically, her injuries were mostly healed by now. The scabs had fallen off, leaving healthy scar tissue in their wake. He massaged the muscles in her limbs to keep them from atrophying, but she would still be very weak, and unfortunately there was no way for Izuru to test whether she'd suffered any permanent neurological damage. Her legs in particular were in danger, given that the multiple injuries they'd suffered could have harmed any of the muscles, tendons, or peripheral nerves within. As he'd predicted, Nanami's brain had slowly started showing signs of activity shortly after his trip outside. She experienced a somewhat irregular sleep-wake cycle, and her face would sometimes twist and grimace without cause. But she did not respond to outside stimuli, verbal commands were ignored, and any movements she made were instinctive, involuntary, not purposeful. She couldn't eat or speak. She was neither fully aware nor fully unconscious, but halfway between. Logically, Izuru knew there was no pattern to someone in a persistent vegetative state waking, and that all things considered, her recovery was progressing well enough. But he still couldn't help feeling slightly impatient. That itch inside him, that need to know her, to see her fully recovered, was becoming difficult to ignore. Mentally, he rifled through his archive of knowledge and talent for any possibility he might have overlooked. Here. Medical studies reported that speaking to vegetative patients sometimes helped them leave the state. The sound of voices stimulated certain nerves in the brain, making it more alert and active. Theoretically, that helped spur it to wake up faster, and apparently offered some modicum of comfort besides. Well, he supposed he could try just to see what would happen. Nanami, he began, and halted. Interesting. Attempting to speak now was making him feel foolish. Was it because of the person he was speaking to? No, he hadn't been struck by this emotion either of the times he'd spoken to her before. Then it had to be because of the situation. Understandable, for all his talent, idle conversation was not his forte. He spoke only when he saw reason to, which was rarely, and couldn't recall ever speaking casually with anyone in his existence. His teachers had only spoken to him to test him, in questions and answers and riddles, and Enoshima was perfectly content to just talk over his silences. What was he supposed to say to someone unable to respond? Play to his strengths. State the facts. It was in man's nature to find the unknown frightening. Logically speaking, then, facts were reassuring. You are safe, Izuru continued, fingers of discomfort crawling like spiders up his spine. Your body is healed well, and the one who wished you ill does not know you are alive. I have been tending to your recovery for the past 5 weeks. She did not respond. Of course she didn't. It was foolish and illogical to assume she would magically awaken at the mere sound of his voice. This was real life, not a romance novel. He searched for something else to say, and remembered what he'd watched only a few days ago. Enoshima stabbing Matsuda and then stomping on his corpse until it was nothing but pulp. You have nothing to fear from me. I am not going to harm you. Her brow crinkled, then smoothed over. An automated response caused by the irregularities in her brainwaves, nothing more. Izuru rose, fingers automatically curling around her hairpin in what had quickly become a habit. Take as much time as you need to recover. I will not leave you. He spoke to Nanami's body a few more times after that, but before long stopped. He simply ran out of things to say, and the embarrassment that came with it became boring. It was months before Enoshima called on him again, months since her experiment had come to an end. He'd watched it all with boredom, seeing the panic of the school board and the bloody corpses of the steering committee left in Ikusaba's wake. The Despair Sisters were back in action. The Ultimate Soldier was currently out doing dirty work for her sister, but he still locked and trapped Nanami's door before leaving. Enoshima was waiting for him in the room she'd held Mitarai in, spinning around in a chair and still dressed in the outfit she'd adorned during her amnesiac phase. He came to a halt inside the doorway, waiting until she slowed enough to see him. A large grin spread across her face, and she stuck a foot out, stopping the motion of the chair. "Kamakura-senpai!" the strawberry blonde gushed, leaping up. "Oh my god, it's been so long! Tell me how you've been! Did you miss me?" Flatly, coldly, he answered, "No." He'd barely thought of her when he wasn't monitoring the school, truth be told. He'd quickly grown bored of being angry at Enoshima. He was not going to act on it, and without some form of catharsis, the state became stale and dull. But to his vague interest, that anger was resurfacing just by looking at her. Additionally, it had fundamentally altered his perception of her. Rather than slight dislike combined with tolerance, as he had previously felt, he now held just dislike, which he had to forcibly rein in. She sniffed, crocodile tears welling in her eyes and mushrooms somehow appearing on her head. "How could you be so cruel? We're supposed to be partners, you know. It's been months since my loss and you're only just now visiting, and then you say something like that. Don't you know it's appropriate to comfort a girl when she loses her lover, not scorn her? My poor Yasuke." She wiped away a calculated tear. "If you did not want him dead, perhaps you should not have killed him." Enoshima tossed her head back and barked out a laugh. The mushrooms went flying away. "Oh, but where would the despair in that be? Love is pain, and pain is despair, so love is despair. I loved my beloved Yasuke so much. I loved him right till death do us part, and it hurts so much that he's gone." Her arms wrapped around her body, red-painted fingernails digging into her skin as she let out a noise halfway between a laugh and a sob. Interesting, for once, Izuru couldn't tell whether she was feigning it or not. But if the emotion was genuine, it vanished in the next second as, with a definitely fake wail, Enoshima buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders heaved with overdramatic sobs. He stared at her with apathy, watching as she wept theatrically, occasionally peeking up at him through her fingers. "You know," she finally cooed, lowering her hands, "this is the part where you're supposed to hold me close as I cry into your chest about my lost love." Izuru let his scornful silence and minute narrowing of his eyes be his answer. Enoshima laughed again, abandoning her weeping widow act. "You really are completely dead inside, aren't you? I wonder, were you born that way, or did my despair do that to you?" Her last idle comment reminded Izuru of one of the conversations he'd eavesdropped between her and Ikusaba, amidst his monitoring of the school. The soldier had asked why she didn't just hand him over to the reserve course. Enoshima had laughed, condescendingly explaining how if she did, their anger would dissipate. Letting the storm build was much more profitable. She'd finished up with a statement that he was definitely in despair now because of her, so it wasn't as though he were a real threat anymore, which had been almost amusing to him. It meant one of two things. Either she was lying to placate her sister, doubtful given what Izuru had observed of Enoshima's past treatment of her, or else she was greatly deluded about how much impact she had on him. Even before he'd discovered Nanami and her hope, he hadn't been in despair, just bored and curious. So for Enoshima to think that she was that influential over his mental and emotional state, it was almost amusing. Still, while the woman herself was boring and predictable, the ideas and experiences she brought were not, and that was what prompted him to ask, "What does it feel like, not just losing the man you loved, but knowing you are the reason he is dead?" A manic grin overcame her face, even more crazed than her usual ones. Kamakura-senpai's asking me to share my feelings with him. Oh, how I've awaited this moment. How could I refuse such an offer? She began roaming her hands across her body, eyes half lidded as she began. It's like someone's ripped my chest open and stomped on my heart, like the sky's falling down around me and the ground swallowing me whole. It's been months now, and this despair is still so despairingly strong, so despairingly beautiful, so despairingly orgasmic. A deep blush spread on her cheeks, and she moaned long and drawn out. It's hard to imagine I could ever feel a despair more despairful than this, and maybe that's the greatest despair of all. Killing the ones you loved was supposed to be the peak of despair? Izuru tried to imagine killing Nanami, and the image it brought did make his stomach roil, but not at all in the pleasant way Enoshima described. If the end goal of despair was murdering your loved ones, wasn't that predictable? Simply all roads leading to the same point in the end? But the actions taken on the way weren't predictable at all. Did unpredictable actions outweigh the fact that they led to a predictable future? Or would the apparently unpredictable actions prove to have patterns in them as well, ones he hadn't yet discerned but eventually would? Or would he find that more than one variation of the future was available through despair?